GTM engineers remove the technical constraints that stop companies from growing as fast as possible.
So you're telling me the data is taking half of your day. And if I can automate this stuff, I will make your reps twice as productive.
Almost no organization is short on ideas. A minimum technical skill that you need for being a GTM engineer is you have to be able to do like VLOOKUP in Excel. The first version of our events invite system that we built was absolutely horrendous. Reps hated it. We had empty chairs at our dinners.
Is this a moment in time, and 100 years ago when you made a phone call, you depended on a switchboard operator? Is this the switchboard operator?
I have a hard time believing there's going to be VPs of GTM engineering.
Hey, everybody. You've got Andy Mowat and Noah Marks here from GTM Council. We are on Full Stack GTM, our podcast series. On this one, we are going to dive deep into the concept of GTM engineering. Every CEO wants it. No CEO can define what it is. We figured if we're going to do it, we got to have the people that effectively coined or popularized the term. So Clay, I have known Kareem and Everett and Varun and a couple others since the very beginning. And I was really honored that Everett, who runs GTM engineering at Clay, was game to come on with us. So we're going to deep dive. We're going to ask a ton of questions. And Everett, welcome. Great to have you here.
Yeah, awesome to be here, Andy. I've also known you for a number of years. So I think this is our first official recorded conversation. So I'm excited.
Yeah, man. It's like sometimes people don't get to hear those combos. I think that's exactly what our podcast is all about, is bringing these discussions between GTM operators like Noah and I and vendors that are changing the landscape like you together. So I'm really excited for this. Well, before, last week when we caught up, Everett, we talked about the definition of GTM engineering. And I honestly think when we write our ebook, we will basically use your words, but I'd love you to talk through how you define it and how you think about it.
Yeah, so my definition of GTM engineering was stolen from probably Clay's actual best GTM engineer, who I could talk about in a minute. But the definition is GTM engineers remove the technical constraints that stop companies from growing as fast as possible. And so, what that means in practice basically is it typically isn't for a lack of ideas that companies don't launch tons of plays and experiment constantly and so forth. There's typically a series of process and technology blockers that stop them from experimenting and iterating and doing this at scale. And I think GTM engineers are uniquely positioned within the GTM stack with hands on keyboards for all the technology to be able to kind of remove all of those blockers and basically reduce the pipeline and lag time from idea to execution to scaling something to everybody in your TAM to as short as possible. So it's a super high leverage position, and I think it's one of the few new roles that, in my opinion, is actually an index on improvements in AI technology. So as models become more powerful, GTM engineers can do more things. There are not a ton of roles that are actually like that in the market today. So it's a fascinating kind of intersection of a couple different things.
Where does this? So the evolution comes from somewhere. To me, part of what you said was often the task of marketing operations, I think, and some of sales operations. Is this the natural evolution of marketing ops to you, or is this sit somewhere else?
I think it is part of a broader situation where I look at marketing ops as, in many cases, largely kind of using maybe more point solutions, or I think actually Marketo pretty much originated marketing ops, stitching things together and basically, using tools to do these things. I think GTM engineers actually build. And so the engineer part really shines through here. Um, and that's why a lot of GTM engineers obviously use Clay, and it's kind of a no code environment. So I do consider a lot of what you do in Clay to be building. But there are tons of GTM engineers out there that are actually writing code. Most of them are on X and not LinkedIn, actually. So I try to hang out in both places. But I think GTM engineers are builders, kind of first and foremost. And it just so happens that the things that they use to build, many of them include, Salesforce or Clay. And I honestly consider Salesforce to be, a builder environment as well. And Most people's views of Salesforce are as Salesforce end users, but for those of us on this call, we actually know there's a whole basically development environment buried in that thing that you can use to build a ton of crazy stuff. And Clay's ethos is the same. And I would distinguish that from other types of GTM tools, which sometimes describe them as like playbook companies, where they kind of run like a playbook and they kind of deliver the same solution to every customer. And so that's again where Clay and where GTM engineering I think takes a little bit of a different tack is we are kind of focused on building and customizing this thing to for every company. And there's a whole track of thought leadership on that of why we think that is kind of the key to growth versus maybe other things.
Is the toolkit versus the shrink wrapped solution.
Yeah, and so, for example, we might get to like Claude Code later, but I kind of think of Clay as like GTM infrastructure. So there's a number of primitives within Clay that you can stitch together. And actually, it's a interesting day to be recording this podcast because we just announced new pricing today, which sort of suggests that to a much greater degree than just kind of buying data from Clay. So yeah, GTM engineers they use GTM infrastructure like Clay or like other things to build their plays. And in my opinion, they really treat the GTM motion more like a product than anything. And a really good GTM engineering team is operating at a cadence that is very similar to a really good product and engineering team that's actually building software.
I love that.
That's right.
Maybe go back to Noah's early question around where this lives. I mean, I think what I've observed is like many of my friends that are running RevOps, you'll buy Clay, you'll be able to look like an absolute rock star very, very quickly, right? Because you can ship lists,
Yeah.
targets, enrichments, but oftentimes the team will be separate from RevOps. And if you're not like connected to it, eventually you look like a rock star, but it's not actually improving the GTM side. You see so many GTM engineering teams. I think Noah and I probably come from the view of like, God, how could you ever have it separate from RevOps? I'd be curious, what's your philosophy on like, where should this live?
Yeah, that's actually one of the downsides that I warn executives about when they're standing up these teams or when they're hiring GTM engineers is that the same like thing that engineers get into of building lots of shiny stuff but not actually moving the metrics happens to GTM engineers as well. And so the ideal pairing actually is, in my opinion, RevOps has kind of like the strategy and the things that they're trying to get done, and they have a number of toolkits for that. But the GTM engineers are a little bit more tactical and a little bit more kind of builder oriented. I do think if you were to nest GTM engineers within the ops team, it's still especially at scale a good idea to kind of house them together because the centralization aspect is a kind of a key thing. In order to iterate quickly on different campaigns and sort of take learnings from multiple parts of the business and improve things with those, you want to have GTM engineers, even if they're attached, like maybe one's to marketing, one's to sales, one's to post sales, you want to still have them all sort of living together. So, for example, the same ICP definition exists across all the different workflows. And to that point, sometimes when I go into customers, it's actually like there are two different definitions of who the ICP is that are between sales and marketing, and some of the initial implementation work for Clay is actually just getting people to align on that, and then building that in Clay takes like 30 minutes. So yeah, I think GTM engineers should live very close to RevOps. I think you can house them within RevOps. Some companies I talk to, they have a concept of like a general team that is trying to implement AI in their org and perform high leverage tasks. And sometimes on purpose, they want to keep that team siloed. But even then, you want that team to sort of dotted line report up into like a senior ops leader so that they don't stray too far from, strategic objectives like cutting gray territories and things like that.
The one thing I agree with
Mm.
everything you said. I think I've seen it go where that shiny object syndrome is huge, and I've seen it with everything from like troops. Originally, when you like fired up troops, it would be like you look like a
Yeah.
hero, and you'd be like, "Fuck, there's way too many of these things." When I design it, I think one thing that I think a lot about is I need this GTM engineering team. I always think of run the business work, right? Like routing leads, cutting territories, doing commissions, and change the business work. I think the ideal scenario for GTM Eng would be it is to change the business arm of the ops function. Once it becomes a run the business, you can move it to like a junior RevOps analyst or something like that to make sure it's done. But I think the danger sometimes where people set this up is like, and I made this mistake at Carta, was giving it to a team that was overloaded and they can't really fully utilize it and live it and understand it. And but you need to be able to say like your job is to drive efficiencies, improve data, and change the business, not to just kind of run it. I'd be curious your take on that.
Yeah, so, on that overloaded point, there's a large kind of, payments company, and one of the problems they wanted to solve with Clay is actually the sheer volume of tickets that were filed for their RevOps team. Things like, employee counts were wrong on a record, and that was impacting which territory it landed in, or the hierarchy was wrong, or the contact data was wrong, or, this automation should exist, or things like that. And so they actually wanted to automate responding to those tickets and pointing people to resources and doing things in the background that were kind of easier to do. And so my observation on a lot of ops teams is, and quite frankly, Clay has a pretty we have a real culture of like submitting tickets for everything for our ops team. And so a lot of the overload that I see comes from just the volume of tasks that are not quite automated by ops teams in the background. So someone actually has to go into Salesforce and click things. And obviously we can't have reps like changing who owns accounts because that would have a bunch of like negative
I'm
effects. But
sorry,
we
can you
also
repeat that just for everyone? I want to make sure that that's
yeah,
just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
And so yeah, we can't just be reassigning accounts willy nilly because my
Ah,
friend works
interesting.
there or whatever. So
Very good
um
point.
like you end up in this purgatory of you don't actually have a system that you can quickly build automations that end up sort of reducing the number of tickets that are submitted. And you're also overloaded with tickets at the same time. And there's maybe no headcount to, add to this. And so it's like, how do you kind of work your way out of that mode? That's pretty tricky. I almost would say that is like a situation where you maybe even do have an agency or a third party kind of help you initially get going, and then you sort of hit your steady state from there. To your original question though, Andy, on like what does the actual steady state look like? I do think the dream is that it does look a little bit more like software where you're able to build things to a degree of quality where they can actually run autonomously, and that when bad things are happening, there is kind of alerting and errors, and in a future state, maybe sort of automatic fixes that are applied. This is actually just so people don't think I'm super biased. This is actually one knock on Clay that we're working on is the alerting capabilities are not kind of where they need to be, especially at like large scale. And and so, the nightmare is that people build all these Clay workflows, but then they don't have the observability that they need to be able to kind of like adjust them and fix them as issues crop up. And Clay itself is also not surfacing some of that. So not to worry, we're fixing that. We're like well aware of that, but the volume of tickets that most ops teams are focused on, especially when you have a sales leader that's like, I don't care about your medium term projects. I need you to like solve this issue right now. You go through your day and you realize you haven't actually built the core thing that was going to address like 30% of the tickets because you were so busy solving tickets that were like escalated. So yeah, the ideal GTM engineer will be able to come in and sort of like cap the number of tasks and random things happening that ops teams are dealing with, and then you'll see a gradual decline through automation, and then you'll see over time, hopefully, a greater and greater number of new plays and things that are shipped and launched, and you'll sort of escape from the RevOps purgatory of drowning in relatively mundane Salesforce tasks.
Can I follow up on that? So the core thing you're seeing, are you seeing more people, the initial deploy is to reduce the inbound problems, is to reduce like you mentioned the ticketing setup, which I think is the most basic baseline element of what ops does. And if that's all that ops does, you're missing the entire upside of the creative element of what do you do next and how do you improve on things. So certainly there's the challenges of an inbound problems across the business that end up falling into ops lap that takes time and doesn't move the needle. So there's certainly very simple. I know that this problem, there's the data here. I can orchestrate a solution, reduce that period. The second part of this equation, which is I equate this a little bit to, I was at Salesforce when the Salesforce One platform came out. And the challenge there is with a toolkit, you can say to folks, I have tools and you can do whatever you want. And then the response is, well, what do you mean? What can I do? Like, well, whatever it is, well, you tell me. And it's a circular reference of capabilities of possibilities. And I think the large part of this industry has been capped by technological ceilings to say this is how you have to do your job. But now that you've said, listen, you can now build your own tools, you can now build your own go to market, that then says, okay, now be creative. Think about all these elements. And I think that's where folks kind of need a little push. Some of us have been thinking about certain elements all our lives, but certainly if you just took Andy and myself, our first inclination will probably be in different areas of the business or different elements. How do you corral so that folks can take that what if scenario and based on your all experience and where you think the best bets are and the best practices to tee folks up to start doing things that maybe nobody's asking for, but really moves the needle within their organization, makes them champions, solves the problems that are really, really cool versus, oh, there's just these, these Salesforce issues keep cropping up and we got to like solve them. The big stuff, the stuff that's really cool.
Yeah, so I sometimes describe kind of like a three-layer hierarchy of needs that I recommend people kind of implement Clay in this order. And the first layer is data. And I actually think most, maybe not a huge percentage of ops tickets and so forth come from basically data quality issues. And data quality issues are very pernicious because it could be like a one-off, oh, we just matched the wrong domain on this record, or it actually could be like a systemic thing where as you dig into a data issue, you actually see that like 30% of accounts are affected by this, this one automation that's like not working correctly. And so data is kind of like the lifeblood of these organizations. And I also will have discussions with people that are worried about, Clay has a centralized approach to prospecting. How do I sort of manage the way my reps are doing prospecting? And I sometimes just like, look, you can take that, in steps, but if you just pipe 50% better phone numbers through your existing motion, you're going to see wins here no matter what.
Yes.
And so your data foundation is step one. Step two is that reducing that ops that ticketing thing or making everybody's lives easier by automating like existing processes. And so obviously prospecting is a target here. Inbound usually is like much more broken than a lot of leaders would like to acknowledge. Territory carves and list creation is usually pretty bad. Pre-call research, post-call follow-ups. There's like a 10 or 20 just basic items that can be automated through Clay or through other tools that are existing things that basically every org is doing. And then the tip of the pyramid is like net new things. And this is really where people start to be able to like launch new plays that they've always wanted to launch, but they never had the capacity for. And in your ideal situation, if you're kind of fully realizing the value of GTM engineering, you would see the number of campaigns and experiments that are shipped begin to increase over time as you are building on top of a layer of like data quality and then automation. And then to your point on like, hey, well, where do the ideas come from and what should we do? My favorite thing is to do like rep ride-alongs. I feel like in a lot of ops conversations, reps kind of get a rough shake, but the fact is that at every like high performing organization, there are a couple of reps that are doing pretty unique things that are allowing them to crush quotas and go home at 5 p.m. or whatever it is. And so usually I like to kind of sit with those reps and just say, hey, like show me your flow. And you learn so many interesting things from this. As a quick story, one of the Clay tables that Canva is running is monitoring the social media accounts of all their major customers and looking for basically poor graphic design because they learned that a
Mm.
few of their reps were finding examples of like poor graphic design, something that looked like it was made in Microsoft Paint, and then they were screenshotting that and they were sending that to the CMO and pitching them on Canva as a solution to create a uniform design system across the company that elevates brand quality and image and so forth. And that was super effective. Like that was like probably, a super manual effort, right? Crawling through all these posts and everything. But the end result was really effective. The problem is one or two reps were doing that. Canva has, hundreds of reps that could be doing that. And so taking that like little nugget and then deploying that on behalf of the entire organization as a signal, that's an example of GTM engineering at its best, where you have a good idea somewhere in the organization. You're just blocked by, a mountain of tickets or poor data quality or other issues that you have to kind of solve for it in order for you to be able to launch plays like that for everybody.
So just to recap, so there's that data system integrity layer, that very first layer that you're tackling. Second one would be building the repeatability and processes. And the third one is ratcheting up the productivity by identifying the best practices around the organization and making those more commonplace practice. Right.
Yeah, that's exactly
Okay.
right. And I really do believe that almost no organization is short on ideas. Like we do these kind of hackathons where we come on site with people and it's usually a pretty productive 4 hour session, but even there we leave like 20 or 30 things on the board. And the problem with like having lots of ideas is it's pretty hard to tell a priori, which ones are really going to hit.
Right. Yes.
And prospecting is like this inherently. You may try a number of strategies without really knowing which one is going to work, and so you have to be able to like launch the experiment and get enough stat sig on it to be able to say if this is a good idea or not. But the problem is most people cannot launch or ship enough things, and they sort of end up in a routine of doing the same thing every day, and that is ultimately atrophies whatever is working well in the go-to-market organization and leads to, in my opinion, lower growth rates and things like that.
I love that. Plus 1 year rep ride along thing too. I had this one sales leader at a company I won't name, but I sat down with this person and I watched for a day. And at the end, I'm like, so you're telling me the data is taking half of your day.
That's right.
And if I can automate this stuff, I will make your reps twice as productive. And he said, yes, you're right. And so that was like when we reached out to you guys. Um, Maybe shifting gears a little bit. The platform of Clay is really evolved, right? Like it evolved from a tabular format where you could go out and get multiple sources of data and use agents to now you're feeding in signals and other things like that. I'd love you maybe just to quickly frame like where the platform is today and what things that it can't do right now that you think it will be able to do in the near future. And I guess the
Yeah.
real question over there is like eventually there's Claude Code building things as well too. And like, are you guys building a agent builder for all of GTM or will there always be things that are supplemented on the side from it?
Yeah, so Clay started with list building, in my
Yeah.
opinion, and as another quick tangent, the what I did with Clay, I worked at a cloud cost management company, and so we sold products that, hey, your AWS bill is this, we'll reduce it to this and give you observability around it and so forth. And so the play that I was running in Clay was I was pointing Clay at GitHub repositories for Kubernetes and enriching the engineers that were starring those repos, then using Clay to find the engineering leaders at those companies and outbound them with Kubernetes cost savings messaging. And the idea was basically if your engineers are, starring repos for complex Kubernetes maintenance projects, that also means that you are dealing with a set sizable Kubernetes cluster that's probably generating millions of dollars of cloud costs and so forth. And that campaign worked fantastically well to the point where our CEO was like, I don't know what this is, but just keep like more of this, please. And that's kind of really where I got into getting to know the Clay team well because we use SalesLoft and Clay didn't support SalesLoft. So I had to like design how that would work together. So I could actually just pipe the messaging directly through and automatically outbound, the context that I was finding with Clay. And so that type of thing is where Clay started. But today, you could go into Claude Code and probably build a very reasonable list of companies that had large Kubernetes deployments and so forth. And so, as much as I hate to say that, I actually am also using Claude Code and finding it very productive for some things that I probably used to use. I probably used to use Clay for. The Clay of today, though, is really more about like production systems that are actually deployed and kind of continuously on. And so there's a couple components of Clay that allow you to build these things. Obviously, the data marketplace continues to be a real focus for us. One of my best LinkedIn posts this week was about our new Lucia integration, which has been in the works for a long time.
By the way,
So
just interrupt really quick on that. Last two unicorns I've been at, the reps in Europe will credit card Lucia,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
and
that's
so
right.
I'm sitting there being like, oh man, I guess they need better phone numbers, but now I got to go deal with another vendor, sign up, deal with the data security, the GDPR, and it's a mess. And so that's why the beautiful thing of these data vendor waterfalls where you can effectively say, I've got one relationship and they're going out and sourcing the best data in each of the places. Like Lucia is like the bugbear. I basically had this deal with procurement where they would crush anything that came in on a credit card on our data, but I would learn. And so I think that the fact that you guys are doing a deal with Lucia is fascinating.
Yeah, and we've gotten pretty specific with it lately. Like we have this data provider, Firmable, only works for Australia, New Zealand. 10 million Australian contacts, million businesses, phones and emails. We have another one, Bohurst, that only works for the UK and Germany. It's got a couple particular compliance things related to it. So like that is actually a major reason why a data marketplace is super nice for RevOps teams, because at some point you are going to end up in all these different regions and honestly on all these different market segments. And if you were really focused on data quality and trying to hit the highest bar there, you would actually end up purchasing like 20 or 30
Yep.
different vendors for that.
100%.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so yeah, so the marketplace really helps there. In addition to the marketplace, there's now a part of Play called Audiences, which is really for like high volume data storage. So think like millions or tens of millions of records. It's built on ClickHouse for the data nerds out there. But for longtime Play users, they're aware of this like infamous 50K record limit where you can get around it, but you have to like delete the data in your table automatically, and it's not great. So Audiences is meant for like basically storing a perfect copy of your TAM that's updated regularly with signals and so forth. And then Audiences also is what our MCP connector to ChatGPT and Claude is built off of. And so now you can actually kind of talk to Clay and get slices of your TAM just like sent back to you via text. So Audiences is almost like a storage piece of infrastructure for some of this. Another part is sequencer, which allows you to, obviously send messages, and then I have sort of a vision for sequencer, which is like a multi-channel sequencer, which I think will be super interesting. And as an example, Clay doesn't currently integrate with any dialers today, but that is a clear target for us in addition to sequencers. And then of course you also have agents. And agents, was innovative in this space originally with our web research agent, Clayagent, cheekily named, which is still sort of best of breed and really useful. But today it's possible to build many other interesting types of agents. And for example, we have a couple customers that are testing an account agent, which just kind of continuously looks at one account and is like fully up to date on everything that's happening with that account. And so that's in my opinion go to market infrastructure. You have a data marketplace, you have audiences, you have sequencer, you have agents, and there's and workflows, shall we say, is another kind of key part of Clay. So where this is headed is Clay's interface can be used, of course, to talk to all these things, you configure them and run them. But I think we're pretty agnostic as to whether you access those pieces of infrastructure in Clay or you access them from your Cloud Code terminal or you access them from ChatGPT. And so it's going to feel similar to maybe like an actual cloud infrastructure provider where you're using different functionality here in the background, but some end users may not even be aware that Clay is actually the thing that is powering whatever they're doing in ChatGPT. And so in that world, you take your far end of like most technical users, basically Clay agencies, which are using Claude Code for lots of things. We want them to be able to use Claude Code, access Clay's data, access audiences, and so forth, and then probably be able to deploy what they're building in Claude Code onto Clay. Because if you guys have played around with Claude Code, there's a couple drawbacks, namely, like it's pretty hard to change what Claude Code is doing. You often want to fix one thing and you break another thing. You have no observability, you have no basically visualization of what's happening. You often hit like rate limit issues because it's running on your desktop. There's parallel execution issues. There's basically all of these things that look a lot different when you deploy what you're building onto the infrastructure that Clay already has, where we, for example, already have super high rate limits with all of our data providers. And so in that world, oh, okay, I'll add one more category here, which is our many of our most advanced customers have already built internal agents that they want to be able to talk to Clay. So
Yes.
some of them have maybe built like a lead qualification agent. And so instead of sending that new lead that comes into Clay, they might send it to their agent, and then their agent will actually talk to Clay to enrich the lead, and then do something with that. And we're perfectly okay with that. And so basically wherever kind of go to market activity is happening, Clay is a place where you can call into and access different pieces of infrastructure to be able to accomplish the task. And then for I'm gonna say like 70% of the market, all the people that we talk to, and they're like, we've been on Zoom Info for years, and whatever. Those people are going to use Clay's UI to do a lot of their work, but a section of our users won't. And some of the most advanced go-to-market engineers will also kind of access Clay the way they might access AWS or Replit or something like that.
One more question, then I want to kick it over to Noah.
Mm.
You didn't mention data warehouse at all. I don't think that word's come out of your mouth yet.
Oh yeah.
And I've always viewed as like, where is the GTM source of truth? Historically, it's been the CRM and map. And I'm seeing some companies start to say, okay, it's data warehouse first. I'm curious, like if I'm showing up to you and be like, no, I need to do all my enrichment. I need to do it into my data warehouse, and then I can run plays on top of that. How does Clay fit into that type of infrastructure?
Well, I certainly favor that. I mean, that's exactly what we do at Clay, quite frankly. It's
Mm.
we have obviously a sync between Salesforce and Snowflake. And one way to think about this is, maybe I'll give Figma as an example here. So their data science team is using Clay to pull together all of the kind of interesting third party attributes that they want to create, and have created some fun ones. They created a design maturity score where an agent visits a company's website and evaluates like the colors and fonts and graphical presentation and all of this. And sort of gives a 0 to 100 score on that. But then they take all those data points and they push them into Snowflake, and the data science team builds like actual models with this, which use the enriched data as kind of like inputs to that model. And so that's a perfectly fine setup. And I actually like, if I had all the resources for that, and in fact Clay is beginning to have all those resources, like we would do that. It's just that I still think that world is fairly technical and like fairly inaccessible to a lot of teams, and a lot of the data science functions in companies, um, for PLG companies, it kind of makes sense that they're all really involved with go to market, because you have millions of users that are doing things, and you have a lot of signal that you can pull out of all of that activity. But for many companies, data science is still actually focused on like non go to market
Products.
activities.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so then you wouldn't, in that case, want to gate the progress that you can make on enriching and so forth by needing your data science team to kind of, provision Snowflake for you and write queries and,
Mm.
and things of that nature. And so I think for that audience, that's really what audiences and Clay is for. It provides you some kind of like high volume storage primitives that you can use. And then actually the cool thing about audiences is it typically is mirrored to Snowflake or to Salesforce. So you can get a lot of those kind of benefits there. The one This is getting a little in the weeds, so hopefully that's okay. But one other division on this is a lot of companies will have a like pretty interesting data model that they store in their data warehouse. So I'm talking about like, dozens of tables and data lineage and metadata that describes how all the data fits together. Audiences, that's too advanced for audiences. Audiences is really a list of accounts and a list of contacts, or maybe a list of users. And so we're again here building for like kind of the middle of the market up, but not like all the way up. And those companies that have these complex data models and DBT running in the background and so forth, we're perfectly happy to just push enriched data into them, or maybe like have those systems trigger Clay to execute campaigns, and allow some of the true analytics engineering to happen inside the warehouse. And that's a setup that makes sense to me.
Love it.
That's good. And not to set up a softball for you, but I want to, because I want the answer here. I Something that is, so I'm curious from your perspective. The metric of, I guess, what's now the decade is NDR, GDR. It's
Yeah.
about your customers. It's about going into your customers and expanding. One of the, if anybody's ever worked on this, one of the toughest campaigns you can ever imagine that you don't expect to be difficult is the ability for marketing to go in and address your existing customer base. Every list has to be scrubbed by a rep because the what you have is the product being used is not necessarily the product. All that data infrastructure is really, really difficult. I think people have been calling it a customer data platform. It's that ability to orchestrate between those, as well as the idea that you now have 17 different channels to communicate with your customers, whether it's out of your marketing system or your CS system or directly
Yeah.
out of any of the tools that sales uses. The challenge there is how many of your, so I'm curious, how many, what percent of your customers are using the GTM engineering and Clay to focus on new business versus going after the existing customer base, and what's the nuance there that people need to recognize if you are going after and trying to incorporate this into existing customers?
Yeah, well, so I first of all, I would segment this into kind of two segments. One is you have your PLG companies like Clay that have a $500 a month plan that like vast majority of their customer base is on. I mean, for Clay, like 90% of our customer base is self serve, and so it's very very popular to run a like self serve to sales conversion play on all of those customers. So I would venture to say like our big name PLG customers, Figma, Intercom, Cursor, etc., are all running that play, and that's a really effective one. Now, whether you bucket that as like self-serve users kind of being this population of leads that really is a part of your pre-sales process to convert those into enterprise contracts, or you bucket those as like existing customers that now expand into enterprise. That's maybe a separate question, but self-serve to sales led, that is like one segment. The other segment is actual enterprise customers that like at Clay they initially bought 100,000 credits, $100,000 worth of credits, and now they potentially could buy two or $300,000 worth of credits as they expand into more use cases. For that, I think the primary thing that Clay is doing here is kind of like that rep assist situation. And so normally, like for us at least, the expansion conversation starts with a QBR with the customer, where we're like, here's everything you're doing in Clay today. Here's what you're not doing in Clay. Let's talk about the not part. And so a very popular play is to do like QBR slide deck creation automations with Clay, where you take your Snowflake data, your Salesforce data, your Gone data, you pipe it all through a table, and you produce a set of slides that contains like a summary of everything that's happened in the account so far. And then the account manager goes in and kind of like reviews those things. Another popular play is sort of like churn detection. So usually you can find out from your first party data as you watch usage drop that maybe customers are in danger of churning. But also there's a ton of third party signals that would indicate that. For example, your primary champion leaves, new skeptic from a prior org joins. That's a really good play because if you're doing this right, you can actually tell from past call histories with that new person that they're actually a skeptic of the solution. And if they've joined a new customer, they might also bring that skepticism to that new customer. And then on the actual like expansion side, I tend to agree with you that typically like the reason for an expansion is nested in some sort of like higher level conversation that is just happening between the account manager and like a leader, or maybe a leader at Clay and a leader at one of our customers. I do think that's kind of where the human nature of this stuff really shines. And if you can support those expansion plays with automation, that's really positive. But there is a chunk of this that is kind of it's left to humans to sort of figure out. And I actually think like expansion with the enterprise accounts is probably one of the main areas where it's like you got to have someone on the ground being able to navigate that. It's going to be we're a long ways away from being able to sort of like provide any kind of real type of automation for that aside from, signals around that and call preparation basically.
I think that's a really good point that you just spelled out, which is the human element, the creative element. AI is not displacing everybody right away. It's making everything much more efficient, but you do need that element of other context still to bring to the table, at least in 2026.
I I got an interesting one too. This is one that's been bugging my mind, and Everett, you and I talked a little bit about it. But I see these specialized players, right? For lack, maybe just to throw out a couple, like a relevance.ai and 11x or something like that. That's taking the sequencer and all the things and solving it in a very specialized way. And then I see the clay platform, and I wonder who eats who over time, right? Like, is that clay building its platform where you don't need specialized people, or is it those specialized ones adding to every function? And I'm curious how you think about that.
So yeah, so the core theory of growth that like Kareem believes in, and also I believe in, is that is that to kind of unlock great growth for your company, you actually need to kind of build like highly specialized things. Every go-to-market motion is different, every product is different, every customer base is very different. So it is so the assumption you'd be making if you're thinking that the more purpose-built platforms, specialty platforms are going to do this, is that the models and so forth and within those platforms can capture all of that uniqueness that is true of every company. My current bet is that they kind of can't. That actually you need human input at in a variety of places within these workflows that where that uniqueness is captured. And you also need an environment, a go-to-market development environment, shall we say, where GTM engineers can go in and sort of like iterate and really build to a high degree of customization the things that these companies need. And I think if the kind of specialty solutions were to expand, you would probably not need GTM engineers anymore. You would actually go back to the world where basically RevOps can buy relevance and set it up, and suddenly everything that they were trying to do with Clay is being done by relevance. That world is kind of a little bit hard for me to see. I actually think if anything, there's going to be more building, and companies are going to end up with like more unique stacks that they have and so forth in the future. And that I think that is kind of why for Clay we really are thinking about this GTM infrastructure concept because whatever you're building, you need infrastructure for that. Um, so yeah, I that said, I don't think there's like not a place for specialized platforms. It's just kind of a race to like see who can be more broadly deployed everywhere. And I think providing people with a set of primitives that they can use to mold things to their company is the right approach versus kind of assuming that a more one size fits all approach is going to be able to capture multiple different types of motions and verticals. But it remains to be seen. So
It's funny because we have another podcast series around agentic SDR, and the two, which Noah's leading, and the two are kind of like literally overlapping, which is amazing.
yeah.
Um, I got Noah. Did you have a question? Because I was interested to go deep with Everett on like the core skill sets with what makes a good GTM engineer and things like that. But did you
Yeah,
have anything?
actually, just to precede that, for any CEO that's listening right now that is just approving a GTM engineer spot on their team, what's the bit of advice that you want to give the first time hiring of a GTM engineer in any of these companies?
Yeah, well, so I'd point to like the way we used to buy software, which we kind of bought the software and like fit our company into the software, So like even if our go-to-market really doesn't make sense as a series of accounts and contacts, we're gonna fit that into Salesforce and like we're gonna make it work. In the AI era, what I think is happening is basically companies are buying AI software and they're fitting the software to their company whatever their motion is, however they go about things, they're kind of doing that. And then when you do that, probably the first thing that happens is it doesn't work. Is that actually like a lot of AI deployments, fail at first. Even a lot of things that you build in Clay, you kind of build like version 4 of them later. That's so much better than the first version that you built. And so I think the number one thing that leadership can do to support GTM engineers is create a culture where failure is not necessarily like punished or seen as a bad thing. And I think this is really true of, for example, where engineering and product teams got to in the last 10 years, where it was fine to ship features that didn't work at all and that failed in the A/B tests, and that's fine. We just revert that and we move on to the next thing. Typically in go-to-market, that is less the case. There is actually a penalty for failure, for campaigns that don't work, for pipeline that doesn't appear, and so forth. And so I think a good leader can relax some of that culture for GTM engineers and allow them to have the first couple cycles of iteration where things aren't working to get to the thing that actually works so much better than anything that they've done before. And the other sort of like problem with this is it can be hard to see results like right away. And this is why actually I really encourage people to start with data, because it's like let's just pipe
Yes.
a better
Yes.
data for something that is mostly working but could be 20 or 30% better so we can show results. But then in the background of that, we'll actually be building the next version of this thing that is like 2x or 5x better. But it's a culturally more difficult thing to do, and it's a little difficult sometimes to sit there and like I actually experienced this at Clay as well in a leadership post and look at like something that is not working for a long time. I'll give you one quick example of that. Clay, as we kind of we started out basically just selling on Zoom completely. I would take, 10 Zoom calls a day. We would never visit customers, never host events, all of this. At some point, Varun was like, we're gonna flip this on its head and we're gonna do like more events than anybody.
Yeah.
Varun's always very ambitious and everything. And so the first version of our like events invite system that we built was absolutely horrendous. Reps hated it. It didn't produce a lot of invites. We had like empty chairs at our dinners and things like this. And it took us probably 2 or 3 months to get to an invite system that actually is like very good. And we are kind of filling up our events and dinners and so forth with all of our ICP people. But there was like a lot of frustration in the initial period of this from everybody. But culturally, I think Clay was able to kind of withstand that. And we knew that there were better versions of what we were building coming. It's just the process of building and creating typically involves a lot of like failing at the beginning, and it can be hard to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel when you're in the midst of that period.
Take that events thing for a second. Obviously, the clay is going to power the data piece of it, the targeting and all that. But there's like a reg component, there's an
Yeah.
ROI component, there's a integrating into Salesforce for attribution component. Like, you didn't build all of that in clay? Did you? What did you build the rest of that in?
No, we built a retool like view that is powered by Clay's data that sits as an iframe within Salesforce. And people can go to that campaign view directly and operate basically a fully functional web app. But then the data that's displayed in that view comes from Clay. And then when you trigger an invite, like we can send invites on behalf of Varun and so forth, through email, through LinkedIn, all of this. That part is also powered by Clay. So the UI UX is Retool. It sits within Salesforce. And by the way, I'm a big proponent of Salesforce as like the place where reps live. But then the data and then the action that happens, that is Clay in the background doing that.
I love it. We talked to another GTM council member that we'll have on. There's another episode in this thing where he was also looking for like the rep UX, and he went with Dust for that piece, right? Like, I'm curious, does Clay ever build a rep UX piece? To because you actually went out and had to go use Retool for that, which has been one of my favorites for
Yeah.
UX. But like, how does Clay think about like, it's funny, like all of us RevOps people, we've all been like, "Oh, we could go out and buy, oh, shoot, I invested in, the one that did, geez, I can't remember the name offhand, but it's like you could go pay more money to get a better rep UX." But we all are like, "Ah, they've got one, it's okay." Right? But it's like we're making better data, we're making better flows, but we're still forcing them to use the same clunky UX. Like,
Yeah.
how do you fix that?
Yeah, so the basic problem with rep tools is that extremely hard to build something that everybody is satisfied with, and actually
Mhm.
the default is that most people are very dissatisfied.
Yes.
And I think actually the trick here, and probably without saying maybe too much, is that you have to basically again provide primitives that allow reps to create their own UI UX. And
Yes.
so Clay is kind of headed in this direction. I don't know some of the exact timelines for this, but we are working on something similar to that, where similar to how GTM engineers use Clay in very unique ways across every company, we also think that reps both within their current company but also across different companies are essentially going to have completely different UIs and UXs that they have. And at some level of fidelity, whether it's the sales manager for their team or individual reps on that team, they will actually all end up with a completely customized interface. The extreme version of this is actually chat, which is, I think, low key, probably one of the most used rep
Ooh,
interfaces of today, where instead of any UI, it's just a free form conversation that
I love
that
that.
reps.
Yeah.
But I still actually think like searching for contacts in a chat interface is not the best
Yeah.
experience. Shout out to Clay's ChatGPT integration, but I still don't find that to be like as satisfying as clicking through, Sales Nav or something. And so And so, yeah, that's kind of where we are headed with this. What we're not going to do is build like an opinionated rep UI that is the same for every customer.
Dude, I love it. One more question, Noah, and then I want to kick it over to you. We would be remiss if we didn't ask this, Everett, which is, what are the skill sets to make a great GTM engineer?
Yeah. Um, the reason that I think the engineer title is there is because fundamentally there is like a if this then that process oriented thinking that like needs to happen. And the go to market systems of today like really are like that. And I'll give you a simple example of basically being in Clay and sequencing contacts and outreach. You have to find the contacts, you have to look them up in Salesforce, you have to dedupe them if you get, multiple records back, you have to enrich them with XYZ data providers. You have to create the messaging. And then actually there's some very tricky things where if you are creating a net new contact in Salesforce, you actually have to wait for that to sync to outreach before you can sequence it in outreach. And so actually my low-key new favorite feature of Clay is our delay action, which I pushed for a long time. But unless you're kind of like a systems if this then that thinker, you're going to get a little bit lost in the like process that you actually need to follow to build these. And so I think that is kind of one of the key skills. I'm not actually convinced that vibe coders, for example, are always the right fit for being GTM engineers because a lot of that is actually like they don't necessarily know how to code, and so they're just creating these huge blocks of code, but they don't actually understand within the code what is happening. They can't necessarily debug it. I think a great GTM engineer will be able to really describe in like a huge amount of detail, whatever process it is that they're building, and they'll be able to kind of zoom out to impact that it's having, but they'll be able to zoom down into like rate limit issues and things like that. So so that said, you don't need an engineering background to be a GTM engineer. Lots of the GTM engineers that we have at Clay are like former consultants, former like analyst folks. Generally, what I tell people is like the minimum technical skill that you need for being a GTM engineer is you have to be able to do like VLOOKUP in Excel. Um, and if you can do that, and if you can apply this like process oriented thinking, then you're most of the way there. The last thing I think is like a real sort of proclivity to be shipping. So there's a lot of reasons why some folks maybe ship more features or plays or data than others. But a big thing is they just don't worry so much about like getting everything perfect and they kind of launch things and get the data back and iterate. I think whenever you're hiring a GTM engineer, you're looking for examples of that. And so like in our interview process now, we go through a flow with people where we ask them, okay, describe how you were doing whatever part of your job, 5 years ago. And we test the process thinking there, like how deep can they go and actually describe that? Then it's like, okay, describe how you're doing that now. And ideally, there's a lot of like AI tools and iteration and optimization that has happened between, what it was like before and what it is now. And if you're not seeing that, then you would kind of question if that person is going to be able to do that for your whole company and for your whole team, which is going to be required.
The key element to this is that engineering element of the go-to-market engineer. Um, is this a moment in time, and 100 years ago, when you made a phone call, you depended on a switchboard operator to make that work? Is this the switchboard operator in 3 years from now? Is this going to be more plug and play? Is VLOOKUP going to be a thing at some point? The requirement, the hurdle of this architect to come into your system, to come into your environment and build these things. Will it get to a point in 36 months where it's more plug and play, and the average operational knowledge worker will be the driver behind this versus a specialized GTM engineer?
Um, I think the answer is basically yes, but the GTM engineer will kind of move up the stack into different things. And I think it'll follow the same trajectory as coding, where basically today we've arrived at a place where the best software engineers in the world are managing like teams of agents that are doing things, and they're basically checking the work, and then debugging is still a very important thing here. I am a little bit amused at the whole AWS recent, span of outages, which were largely caused by generative coding tools and people kind of not really understanding what they were building. So So yes, I do think like your average knowledge worker will start to basically have an agent or a couple of systems that do some of the things that GTM engineers were doing today. But GTM engineers will then be managing like 20 agents that are doing different things, and the leverage that GTM engineers have in their organization will continue to increase. On this point though, I think what that means is you may not, I don't know if you're going to see like 200-person GTM engineering orgs. Like I just don't think it's that kind of role. I think it's always going to be a fairly small tiger team that the leverage that they get in the organization is going to be because of improvements in basically AI models, and it's not going to be the type of thing that software engineering was for a while, where it's like if we need more features, we need more engineers. And so I think it is going to always remain like a somewhat specialized role. It's just like right now we're at that point where, you know, there are not nearly enough GTM engineers in the market for all the companies that want to build teams of 3 to 5 of them, and so it feels like a very fast, ramp up of this role. But it would, like I have a hard time believing there's going to be like VPs of GTM engineering, I guess I'd say.
I think they may grow up to be able to actually direct the ops people over time. You could see a scenario where it's like you still need a lot of running the processes that come out of the GTM engineering, but it'll be a fun one. Cognizant of your time, Everett, we could go on for hours on this side, and I deeply appreciate you taking the time with Noah and I. We're excited to collaborate with you guys to turn this insight, this interview into like a deep ebook, because I think every company's asking these questions of like, how do I think about GTM engineering? So deeply
Yes.
thank you, coolest man.
Yeah, you're welcome, guys. I'm surprisingly available for podcasts and doing this kind of stuff. It's always my favorite thing. So happy to do more here. But yeah, it's amazing time to be kind of directly in this space. It's one of those places where AI is working the best, where the results are there, and so it's just like it's sort of like a moment in history to some degree.
Well,
Very
thank
cool.
you, Everett.
Awesome. Thanks, Everett. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, guys.